I remember being at a point in my mathematical journey, if you like, where I could do the mathematics, I could solve most of the problems, but I definitely didn't get it in terms of, oh, I understand why this is important, or I can see how these pieces fit together. I would characterize it as, I know how to drive a car, and I know how to do that safely, but I do not understand how a car works except for like the barest basics, right? And that's probably the way that I would describe the way that I handled mathematics. So how did I get from that place, you might call it a utilitarian relationship to mathematics, to I grasp it, I appreciate it, all those kinds of things. The first piece of the puzzle is, I'd probably say, and this is not, I'd love it to be more insightful and flowery and full of sparkles, but it's just perseverance. And I think that it's very common for us to give up at not necessarily the first sign of difficulty, but I'm thinking of a situation where this is not something I had to learn as a student, but I wanted to learn it as a teacher. And I remember I just hit brick wall after brick wall. So scaling. Scaling is this idea of there are all these different subjects and they somehow have to be put on a level playing field of sorts in order to calculate a tertiary admission rank, right? Now, people always talk about, well, this subject scales better than this subject, or this subject doesn't scale well, or all those kinds of things. And I remember as an early career teacher thinking, I don't know how that works. I know there's lots of mathematics behind it, but I'll just put that in I'll worry about this later category because I can teach successfully without it, right? It's probably after 4 or 5 years or so, that I thought, I've got enough understanding of the curriculum as a whole. I'm going to go after this question now. And the first person I asked basically gave me an answer that made sense to them, but made no sense to me. And I think this person had internalized their understanding of the process so effectively, I guess you would call it curse of knowledge type situation, where they know it suits so well, they forgot what it would be like to be a novice to not be at that level of understanding. So no help. I went to some other people who I thought might be able to come down to my level a little more easily. And what I rapidly found was that none of those people really understood it either and kind of had vague sort of senses. And it probably took me a good 3 to 4 months of bouncing around between people, eventually going to what you might call the source material on the Board of Studies website, which I'm going to say was technically accurate, but not pedagogically helpful. Sure. It wasn't written that wasn't the design of it. The intent of it was to give accurate advice, whether or not that was easy to understand, right?
Sure.
And it was going through that process, which took several months, right? And then testing it out and saying, oh, okay, I'd try out an explanation of what I thought made sense to me on someone, and it would maybe work, or it would not land at all. And that's a long process. And I describe that as 3 or 4 months. There are some concepts that I've taught in classes that have taken me 2 to 3 years, because I'd give it a go. The first year I teach it, didn't land all that great. I knew I'd have to improve it, but I had too much going on in my brain for my other lessons and classes to do that 3 to 4 months work. I'd just revisit it 12 months later when I taught it again, or maybe later in the year when I was teaching a related concept to a different class. And so that process stretched out over a really long time. So that perseverance should not be underrated. It's not a cool answer, because I'd like you do this thing and then it's fine, right? But I strongly suspect that for many of the concepts that are being described by this particular person, they probably don't fit in that category, and they take that amount of time. So there's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing, this will probably be enough, I'd be interested in your reflections as well. The second thing is, I'm always searching for another angle on something. And often the obvious angle, the one that maybe is given by a textbook and is pretty mainstream, I'm the kind of person who I'll look at things, and even from one line to the next, I'll say, I don't know why they're doing that. And in some ways, I guess what I'm trying to say is the disadvantage of being in this stream of I don't know idea what's going on and I'm very confused by this is its own strength in that it equips me to say, this bit and this bit and this bit are not immediately apparent to me as a learner, and so they're probably not going to be immediately apparent to my students either. And so even though that means I then create a whole lot of work for myself as I try and understand that and dig down and look at book after book after book and just ask lots of people. That's one of the questions actually, like who do you ask? Yep. Colleagues, other students. I sometimes get insights from watching my students. I'll give an explanation, it won't quite land, but then I'll listen in on peers as they're trying to grapple with it. Yep. And a thing that they say, they'll make a connection that I've forgotten because I've got my head in other classes and all that kind of thing. So I listen to as many people as broadly as I can. And eventually you synthesize that into something which clicks for you and also gives you multiple entryways into saying, okay, scaling's a little bit like trying to be able to compare two different sports. It's like, oh, okay, so it's like, this sport requires a lot of strength and this sport requires a lot of dexterity and this sport requires a lot of speed or some combination of all of those. And here's what this is like. It's like a metaphor, right? And there's no shortcut to that, but I find that the diversity of reading and questioning is probably what helps me most. When we say that makes intuitive sense to me, I think you hit the nail on the head when you say, if we can show there's a parallel or relationship between this new knowledge that you're wrestling with and seems like it doesn't make sense to you, with this thing that you feel comfortable with, where there's this cognitive sort of, yes, this clicks, and I fit it into, I guess we would say, it fits into my mental schema, right? And to then introduce something which feels separate, but then you realize it has parallels. I remember the first time, and it was embarrassingly recent actually, when I realized, oh, the reason why we can draw this connection between the coefficients of a binomial expansion, a plus b all to the power of 5, it's got that 1, 5, 10, like that structure, which I remember learning relates to Pascal's triangle, and I'm like, yeah, but why? Dunno, because it's cool and that's enough, right? And it's outside the scope of my thinking right now to try and work it out. And then to realize, oh, because when you're expanding, if we were to do it longhand, we would treat, say for example, if I was expanding a plus b, we lump together a squared b cubed. We lump together all of the terms like that, but actually there are distinct terms underneath that. There's AA, BBB, and then there's AB, ABB, and all of the other versions. Yep. And they're permutations. And my brain had never thought of algebraic terms in combinatoric, from a combinatoric angle. And I realized I've been doing this the whole time, but just kind of ignoring it from a permutations point of view. And that's why I just say, how many a squared b cubes do you have, right? And so all of that algebraic thinking that I'd spent so many years doing, which I would say I'm still 10 times more familiar with, I brought that into, I was able to connect that to permutations and combinations, which I still feel a bit funny about, to be honest, even after 15 years of teaching it, and that's what intuitively makes sense. So I think, like you point out, this is not the fault of a textbook, because the textbook's not designed, as you pointed out, to find every single human being and say, well, given your previous knowledge or your experience and so on, what's the thing that connects to you? It's to provide something that, gives you the logical explanation, even if it's not the one that will make intuitive sense for that particular learner. So I think, as you mentioned, it's a matter of looking broad enough and again and again and again to find the right thing that clicks for you.